They cut off his water without warning, and within days his daughter was on her knees in the dark with a shovel, digging into ground that shouldn't have been wet. The blade struck something hard. Metal. Callie Hensley froze, her breath catching in her throat. She wiped sweat from her forehead, leaving a streak of mud behind, and stared down at the shape emerging from the dirt. A pipe. Old, rusted, but unmistakably a pipe, buried on a farm that had been bone dry for 3 straight months. Before we go further, if you love stories about family land, buried secrets, and the fight to save what belongs to you, hit subscribe right now and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. You will not want to miss how this one ends. Now ask yourself this: why would there be water running beneath a farm that had been declared officially completely dry? And who would go through the trouble of burying it? Not long before that night, Walter Hensley had stood at the edge of his cornfield and watched the leaves curl inward like they were trying to protect themselves from the sun. The stalks that should have stood tall and green by late summer were pale, brittle, folding in on themselves one row at a time. His cattle crowded the trough near the barn, jostling for space around a puddle that barely covered the bottom. He'd rationed the last of his hauled water that morning, splitting it 3 ways between the herd, the garden, and the house, and even that hadn't been enough. He was 58 years old, and he had never in his life seen the irrigation ditch run completely dry. "Emergency drought restrictions," the county irrigation officer had told him over the phone, in a voice that sounded like he was reading from a script. "Every property on the shared canal system is affected. We're prioritizing based on need." "Based on need," Walter repeated. "Funny thing, I drove past the Callaway place this morning. Their fields are green as June." There was a pause on the line. "I can't speak to specific allocations, Mr. Hensley." Walter hung up before the man could say anything else. He stood in his kitchen for a long moment, staring at nothing, his jaw tight. 60 acres of corn, 30 of soybeans, a herd of 40 head of cattle, all of it depending on water that had simply stopped coming. His father had farmed this land, his grandfather before that, and now, in the space of a single dry season, it felt like it could all slip through his fingers. That was when Dean Calloway's truck rolled up the driveway. Dean stepped out slow, unhurried, like a man who already knew how the conversation was going to end. He was younger than Walter by a decade, but he carried himself like he owned every acre he looked at, including the ones that weren't his. "Rough season," Dean said, glancing at the wilting corn with something that almost passed for sympathy. "Rough for some," Walter said. Dean smiled thinly. "I'll get straight to it, Walter. I know things are tight. I'm willing to make you an offer on the place. Fair price, quick close, no need to drag this out while your crops die in the field." Walter felt his stomach turn. "What's your idea of fair?" Dean named a number. It was less than half of what the land was worth even in a bad year. "That's not an offer," Walter said. "That's an insult." "It's reality," Dean said, and the pleasant mask slipped just enough to show something colder underneath. "This drought isn't ending soon, Walter, and this farm won't be worth much of anything once those crops finish dying. You might want to think about that before you turn me down." Walter's hands curled into fists at his sides. "Get off my property." Dean held his gaze a moment longer than necessary, then shrugged and climbed back into his truck. He didn't look angry. That was the part that unsettled Walter most. He looked like a man who was certain he'd already won. Over the days that followed, Walter did what generations of farmers before him had done when the water ran out and the bills kept coming. He sold 2 tractors he couldn't afford to keep idle. He thinned the herd, sending 8 head to auction for less than they were worth. He hauled water in a rusted tank on the back of his truck, driving 40 minutes each way to the nearest working well, filling it, driving back, watching half of it evaporate before he could even use it. He stopped buying anything that wasn't strictly necessary. He watched his daughter go without new shoes for school so the cattle could drink. Callie was 19, home from her first year of community college to help for the summer, and she watched her father grow thinner and quieter with every passing day. She watched him rub his eyes at the kitchen table at midnight, staring at bank statements like they might rearrange themselves into better numbers if he looked hard enough. "We're going to lose it, aren't we?" she said one night, not really a question. Walter didn't answer right away. "Not if I can help it," he finally said, but his voice didn't have much conviction left in it. That night, unable to sleep, Callie walked the property with a flashlight, the way she used to as a little girl when the world felt too big and the barn felt safe. She passed the old fence line near the eastern edge, the one that marked a boundary nobody had bothered to check in years, and something made her stop. The ground was dark there, damp even. She crouched and pressed her palm flat against the soil. Cool. Impossibly cool, in a summer that had cracked every other inch of the farm into hard, sun-baked plates. She followed the dark line with her flashlight beam, and it ran arrow straight across the property, disappearing toward the old tree line at the edge of the farm. She went back for a shovel. Which brings us to where we started. Callie on her knees in the dark, mud on her face, staring at a pipe that had no business being there. She didn't sleep the rest of that night. At first light, she pulled her father out to the spot before he'd even finished his coffee. "Dad, you need to see this." Walter frowned down at the exposed section of galvanized pipe, brushing dirt away with his boot. "Oh, probably an old fence line pipe, or something from your great-grandfather's day. Half-buried scrap, nothing more." "Then why is the ground around it wet?" Walter opened his mouth to answer, and then stopped because he didn't have one. They dug together for the rest of the morning, uncovering more of the pipe than either of them expected, a run of heavy, old-style, galvanized steel, remarkably intact despite decades underground. Walter crouched beside it, running his thumb along a seam in the metal, something tugging at the edge of his memory. "My father mentioned something like this once," he said slowly. "Said there used to be an old irrigation system on this land, way before the shared canal ever got built. Said it got shut down and buried before I was even born. I always figured he meant it got torn out, not buried whole." "Where does it go?" Callie asked. They spent the next 2 days following it. The pipe disappeared beneath the soil and resurfaced again and again like a buried river. They found a rusted valve cover half swallowed by grass, a cracked concrete access point, a corroded junction box that split the line in 2 directions. Callie sketched the route on a legal pad as they went, marking each discovery, and by the second afternoon, the trail led them to a structure at the far southern corner of the farm, a squat concrete building choked in weeds that Walter had always assumed was an old storm shelter. It wasn't a storm shelter. Inside, coated in dust and cobwebs, sat an old pumping mechanism, heavier and more elaborate than anything Walter had expected. He crouched beside it, tracing the pipe fittings with his flashlight. "This doesn't connect to the canal system," he murmured. "Look at the angle of this intake. It's not pulling from the shared line at all." "Then where's it pulling from?" Walter's face went pale. "Underneath us." There was an old iron valve wheel, seized with rust. Callie grabbed one side, Walter the other, and together they threw their weight against it. Nothing. They tried again, straining until Callie's arms shook, and then a groan of metal, a shift, and the wheel finally turned. For a moment, nothing happened. Then they heard it. A low vibration humming through the pipe beneath their feet. A rush, faint at first, growing steadier. Water began moving through the old outlet at the edge of the field. Walter dropped to his knees in the dirt, pressing his hand into the widening puddle like he needed to feel it to believe it. It wasn't much, a trickle compared to what the farm needed. But it was real, and it was more water than the shared canal had given him in 3 months. For the first time since the drought began, Walter Hensley smiled. It didn't last. A couple of days later, walking the line again, Callie noticed something that made her stop cold. The flow wasn't coming from the direction of the canal at all. It was moving away from the house, out toward the old pumping station, meaning the system wasn't bringing water in from anywhere. It was pulling water up from somewhere underneath the farm itself. "Dad, this isn't connected to the canal system at all. This is pulling from underground. There's a reservoir under our land." Walter stood very still. Something his own father had said decades ago surfaced in his memory, a sentence he'd never fully understood until now. "They buried the line after a fight over water," Walter said quietly. "What fight?" "I don't know. I was young. I thought it was just an old man talking about old grudges." He looked out over the property, over the pipe they'd unearthed, over the pumping station that had been silent for longer than he'd been alive. But if that's true, Callie, somebody buried this on purpose, and I think I might know who. That night, Callie went through boxes in the attic, looking for anything her grandfather might have left behind. She found an old photograph tucked into a cigar box, curling at the edges. The pumping station stood in the background, clearly visible, still active. And standing beside it, one hand resting on the very same valve wheel they'd just turned, was a younger version of a face she recognized. Roland Calloway, Dean's father. "Dad," she whispered, carrying the photo downstairs. "The Calloways knew about this. This isn't some forgotten pipe nobody remembered. They knew." Underneath the photograph, wrapped in an old handkerchief, was a leather notebook, her grandfather's handwriting filling page after page, notes on water levels, irrigation repairs, property lines, and near the back, a single entry that made the hair on Callie's arms stand up. "Line closed for good today. Told them no for the last time. They'll get nothing from this land while I'm breathing." "He shut it down himself," Walter said, staring at the words, "because he refused to sell them access." The next morning, they drove into town to the county archives and requested every record connected to the property's original water rights. It took hours of digging through filing cabinets, but they found it, a decades-old irrigation agreement, faded but legible. It confirmed that the underground reservoir belonged entirely to the Hensley property. It confirmed the Calloways had once been granted temporary emergency access decades earlier during a different drought, access that was explicitly barred from ever becoming permanent. But one page was missing, torn cleanly from the binder. "Someone didn't want this seen," Callie said. The clerk, flipping through the sign-out log to check when the file had last been pulled, frowned and turned the ledger around so they could see it. Only one name had requested that same file in years, a law office retained by the Calloway family, weeks before Walter and Callie had ever thought to look. Callie felt a chill settle over her. Dean hadn't just heard rumors about an old pipe. He'd gone looking for proof of ownership himself, and someone on his side had made sure the proof disappeared before anyone else could find it. The clerk mentioned, almost in passing, that surviving records sometimes referenced older engineering surveys stored separately. Callie caught a reference number scrawled in the agreement's margin and asked to see it. 20 minutes later, they had it. An original engineering report from the same year the line was shut down. It laid everything out in black and white. The Calloway family had requested permanent rights to the underground water. Walter's grandfather had refused. The line was buried within the month. "They've been trying to get this water for 3 generations, Walter said, his voice shaking with something between fury and disbelief. "The drought didn't start this fight. It just gave them an excuse to try again. And now I know why Dean showed up here so fast. He already knew what we'd find, because his own people went looking for it first." Dean Calloway found out fast that they'd found the line, faster than Walter expected. He showed up at the farm 2 days later, and the friendly mask was gone entirely. "That water belongs to the irrigation district," Dean said, standing too close, his voice hard. "You touch that system again, I'll have lawyers on you by Friday." "Funny," Walter said. The county records say otherwise. And funnier still, your lawyers already knew that, didn't they? Since they're the ones who pulled the file before we did." Dean's jaw tightened, just slightly, just enough to give him away. "I'll help you manage it," he said instead, recovering. "Split the access, keep it fair for both farms. Simple as that." "You mean take it," Callie said, "like your father tried to." Something flickered across Dean's face, recognition maybe, or the first real crack in his composure. He turned without another word and drove off. Callie wasn't finished. She spent the next several days combing through every remaining record in the county office, and she found the piece that sealed it, an old maintenance ledger showing the system had never failed mechanically. It had been shut down deliberately, on the exact date her grandfather's notebook referenced, specifically because the Calloway family had pushed too hard, one time too many. Alongside it, a surviving property survey placed the entire reservoir and pipeline within the Hensley boundary, with no ambiguity at all. A county hearing was scheduled for the following week. Dean arrived with 2 lawyers and a folder full of arguments about shared district resources. He insisted the old system had been long abandoned, meaning ownership was, at best, unclear. Walter laid the original survey on the table. Dean argued the water had always been informally shared between the families. Walter set the engineering report beside it. Dean claimed flatly that he'd never known the old system existed. That was when Callie stood up. "Then why," she asked, "did your own attorneys request this exact file from the county archive weeks before we ever set foot in it?" The room went quiet. Dean's lawyer shifted in his seat. Callie placed the photograph on the table next. Roland Calloway, hand on the very valve his son now claimed ignorance of. Then, Walter placed the final document down. The original agreement, signed by both families generations ago, proving beyond doubt that the Calloways had always known exactly who the water belonged to. Dean had nothing left to say. The county ruled in Walter's favor within the week. The restriction on his water access was formally lifted. Dean's claim was rejected outright, and with it, any hope he'd had of forcing a sale. Walter didn't come out of it rich. That was never the point. What he got back was something worth more than money, a reliable source of water that had been running beneath his own land the entire time, waiting to be found. Over the following month, father and daughter worked side by side, restoring the old system, tying the original buried line into modern drip irrigation that stretched across every field. Water reached the corn again. New seedlings went into the ground where the old crop had failed. The cattle drank freely from a trough that never ran dry. Slowly, the cracked brown earth gave way to green. One evening, standing beside the old pipeline as water hummed steadily beneath their boots, Walter put a hand on his daughter's shoulder. "I spent 30 years thinking this farm's survival came down to how hard I could work," he said. "How many hours I could put in before sunrise, how much I could sacrifice." "And now?" Callie asked. "Now I know it also depended on somebody willing to look at what was right in front of them and ask why." He looked at her, something proud and exhausted and grateful all at once in his eyes. "You didn't just find water, Callie. You found the part of this family's history somebody spent 3 generations trying to keep buried." Callie looked out over the fields, green again for the first time in months, the same land everyone had quietly written off as finished. The drought hadn't destroyed this farm. Giving up on it would have. If this story moved you, make sure to like this video, subscribe for more stories just like it, and tell us in the comments what you would have done in Walter's place. We'll see you in the next one.